All right. Thank you, Prime Minister, for that fine speech calling upon the LO. Just a reminder, keep your speeches within the 7:20 mark.
Sorry, I think my screen was glitching a little bit. I couldn't quite see the timer, but either way. Sorry to interrupt. Just want to check. Ishan, are you giving reply?
Yeah, I'll give reply.
Okay. Sorry, I have to go now. Best of luck, Op. Thank you, Op. Thank you, judges, for the debate. Sorry, I really need to run work.
Just 30 seconds before I start my speech. Thank you.
LO, could you please start your speech?
Yep. Just 2 seconds. Just let me get my water bottle. Before I start that, by that time I'll give my introduction. Blah 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 blah. When we started my speech at a background of just a second. Just let me have a seat. Cool. Gonna start my speech at the background of 3, 2, 1, 0. Panel understand that Gao painted a false picture of how the elections are usually happen, or else matlab, how the political parties usually act. So we'll start with the framing first. Firstly, understand panel that matlab, how will the elections happen now? Firstly, understand panel during the election process. There are some 4 to 5 months of like election campaign period, some end time of election campaign period, during which there are many forms of identity politics, religious politics, etc., etc. Both parties like focus a lot on these identity politics and religious politics to sway the voters, etc., etc. As the Gov beautifully pointed out, all politicians are a-holes. At that point of time, and they will gamify this and they will gamify the system. At that point of time, we want to tell you on how matlab, even if we prove to you that why on their paradigm there is more gamification of the system, or else the voters will be coerced even more, and how the principles of democracy will be compromised even more on their paradigm. At that point of time, we take this debate because that is the only impact that they give you. Now, understand panel that as they give you no framing on how these guidelines of Supreme Court will act, let me tell you how these will act. And this is too late to bring it up on DPM. So the panel has to take our framing. Understand panel that right now how elections will happen is all the in all the countries elections will happen, and at one point and at the same time all the ballots will open. At that point of time, when to actually determine whether a constituency has nota majority is there or not, all ballots have to be open. At that point of time, for suppose take example in like Haryana, some Haryana, etc. At that point of time, to determine whether this constituency or else one or two constituencies have nota majority or not, the results of the rest of the constituencies are already determined. Now, at that point of time, whether if a constituency actually has some nota majority, now what will happen now? The government will go transfer into an interim government, etc., either by president rule or by the or by the rule of the previous party. You can take both, but you can take both. Even then, at that point of time, the period of the interim government also matters. Understand panel that if two parties go on to their election campaign and spend 3 to 4 months swaying these voters onto their sides, if that does not convince the voters to vote to their party, if you give a short period of time like 15 days or 20 days, it will not work. Why? Two reasons. Firstly, to actually firstly, you do not know the demographics of the voters who actually gave nota. That is, even in your constituency, you do not know which caste, which religion, or else which age demographic actually gave you a nota. At that point of time, you cannot go ahead and campaign or appeal to that certain demographic to actually vote for you rather than approaching everyone. At that point of time, when these parties cannot shift their minds for like past 3 4 months, it is very unreasonable to say that they will sway these voters in 15 days. At that point of time, what you have to do is you have to increase the period of the interim government which exists now. Why is that significantly harmful? Understand, panel, like to not to compromise with the principles of democracy. Already the government gives you a certain the election code mandates no projects or no approvals or no bills have to be paid to the vendors, etc., for the past 4 to 6 months of the before the elections, while the start of the election campaigns. That is when the election campaigns actually start. During this period, the states already suffer a considerable loss, or else the country already suffers a considerable loss, because all the development comes to a halt. All the welfare projects, all the developments come to a halt. For suppose the road I have connecting to my home right now, the tender is passed before 3 to 4 months or etc. Even my next street has a cement road, but our street doesn't, because during the time the construction starts, the election period actually started, so the development or else the project came to a halt. At that point of time, you are literally forcing this entire state to go into a development halt for another for a long period of time, because as I've actually proved, a short period of time doesn't do anything. Kaushiki POI.
It's lie that most of the electoral committees and commissioners do know about the electoral voting that they have. I don't think so that's true on your side.
Okay, didn't get your POI at all. If you want, you can bring it in your speech, or else my deputy will be happy to answer that. Now, at that point of time, understand, panel, that now actually when these re-elections do happen in states with crushing majority of these parties, now in re-elections, when there are actually less number of constituencies in which elections are actually going on, or else the parties know that their election campaigns actually fail. Now how will they try to sway voters, as they can't really change their manifestos in these 15 days to sway these voters? Now there will be two ways how they want to sway their voters now in these constituencies. Either by force, or else by scaring these voters into voting for them, or else B, giving them freebies, both of which are actively harmful for the principles of democracy. Actively harmful for the principles of democracy. Understand, panel, firstly, who actually give nota what are who are the three types of voters that exist in Indian politics? A, who actually go to vote, or else B, who do not go to vote because they don't really like these both parties, or else C, who is just lazy to go to vote, like they don't want to stand in the line because they really don't care about they really don't care about who wins. Uh, at that point of time, the third category of voters becomes the primary source of coercion for these parties. At that point of time, when we actually prove to you that in re-elections, the voter turnout will be coerced by these parties, either by force or or else freebies, which is actually more than the election process, because now there are small number of constituencies and these coercion will be now concentrated, and they are actually known that their election campaigns, or else their previous coercion to actually fail in their households. Now at that point of time, when we prove to you that in their paradigm the principles of democracy is actually being compromised more, and we have actually proven to you that even the economic while the rights are being compromised, even the economic incentives are being compromised, and the state is going in a developmental halt for 2 to 3 months. At that point of time, we take this debate panel. Proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you, Elo, for that fine speech calling upon the TPM. Here, here.
Yep, just 30 seconds. As I said before, I'm okay with recording and spectators. So if someone is recording, like, just give me a confirmation that it's still going on. Great. Just, yeah, 10 seconds. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Two clarifications. The debate is about democracy in general, even if it's set in India. First minute of Chinmay's speech. Secondly, democracy says that people are ends in and of itself, same what Chinmay said, which means voting is a constitutional right, not a constitutional duty. The reason why this is true is because you're brought into it without consent and you necessarily need to opt into it. OP has agreed with our framing, but they've disagreed with the impacts to reach it. OP responses. The first thing they say is that you don't know who votes NOTA. Like, this is just blatantly untrue, right? Parties have access to voter data. They know who their voter base is because they're catering to their voter base. BJP knows the people who vote for them are going to be Hindus because they pander so much to Hindus. So when they see that their present voter base is not enough, they expand and they try to expand their voter base. They try to go beyond who their present voters are because they can see that there are certain people who should be in their voter base who are now opting in for NOTA because they've realized that there's bullshit going on in their government. Even if they don't know who their voter base is, what they do know is that they're losing real elections because they're simply not good enough. Secondly, and this is important, right? Because this is why we're winning this debate. Instead of parties having to be like better than the other party, therefore the less of two evils, parties have to cross a line, a threshold of being good enough to be better than nothing, literally nothing. Secondly, giving freebies is harmful for democracy. We can completely flip this argument. You get more freebies in status quo when NOTA means jack shit because you can get away with giving meaningless promises. What happens if those promises of those freebies, and by definition, freebies are things that don't really matter that much, right? They're tokenistic forms of giving out voter benefit, which means what happens if these promises fall over and over again? On opposition, you still vote for the party because some freebie coming from one party is better than nothing. On NOTA, you have the ability to tell this party that no, the freebie that you're giving is not enough. We want something better. We want more representation. We want better elections. We want better candidates who are able to represent our votes better. Thirdly, in terms of being more time for interim government, which means development comes to an absolute halt, I don't see why this is true, but even then, like 2 extra months of the interim government being there is not going to posit as much harm as like the benefits that we get of democracy in and of itself becoming better. But secondly, this is more bad, like this is worse for parties rather than citizens because of costs and things like that. I'll prove this in weighing, which means parties have a greater incentive to not go for re-elections in the first place, right? Why is more voter turnout likely in the first place? We tell you firstly, because obviously, since it's an option now, which loads of people who did in the past want to choose, but can't choose because by the context slide, it doesn't really affect elections. If 100 people are voting, 99 vote for NOTA, one person votes for a particular political party, those NOTA votes don't get represented, which is why like the principal argument of representation and preferences being realized is true. But now those 99 people are likely to turn out more to vote. In fact, we'll probably see more voter turnout greater than those 100 people voting, because now NOTA, that is expressing a discontent with the political system, is a realized option instead of a fake option. Secondly, we tell you that because this policy, it's already like put into news, it's reached the CA teams' heads, which means like it's already publicized. If it comes into fruition, it's going to be taught as like a consequentialist action in elections. That probably means in your civics textbooks, NOTA being seen as a very real and legitimate thing. It probably means that there'll be ad campaigns, political campaigns to tell people that you should go and vote and exercise your right to opt into NOTA. So that's why opt-in is true. Why is opt-in good, therefore, and why is voter turnout in and of itself good? One, on parties, two, on voters themselves. The first, on parties, we tell you that statistical division between like two parties like between two types of people who cannot vote and don't want to vote is crucial for an election structure. This is because you want to see actually what are the kinds of people who aren't able to vote because of structural reasons. So not only can you benefit them through your democracy, but now you can see the people explicitly who do not want to vote, who are expressing their preferences through NOTA. The likelihood for this was given above, which means now we achieve like three different forms of impacts. The first is that you're able to hold systems more accountable. For example, if both parties have criminals inside of them, you can just choose to not want these criminals in the party by creating like enough social media discourse. You put this therefore into elections, which gives parties a damn good incentive to not have criminals being the leaders of it anymore, which happens very really in India. Secondly, we get more and better representation, and this is a crucial impact because parties are getting scared of outvoted by NOTA because they're not good enough. Therefore, they start catering to the NOTA likely voters more. Who are these people? Therefore, opposition thinks these people are like question mark, right? We know who these people are. They are minorities from various communities across India who know that both parties are absolute crap in terms of them. They don't want to vote for the majority party because the majority party most often is against them, but they also don't want to vote for the other party because the other party does not do enough for them. The only way, therefore, that they can express their votes across different communities, and just because they're a minority doesn't mean they're a minority in number. Because they're coming from various communities across India, it means that there's a likelihood and a greater like chance for these people to actualize the NOTA vote. Therefore, NOTA becoming like number one most elected in most of the constituencies. This is enough to be a tipping point in certain elections. But the weighing for this is re-elections may be a minor inconvenience for citizens every 2 months, but it's much worse for parties for three structural reasons. The first is that costs go up, which means like parties just have to pay more money, they run out of funding. Secondly, discourse and callouts increase as either party's analysis gets better over time. You just get more time to call out parties. Thirdly, parties that come second have the most to lose because these people can just fluctuate in preference and some other party can just take up. The impact is simple. Parties give more concessions to offensives for minorities, etc. Before I move on, short POI.
None.
Seeing none. Thirdly, in terms of why representation is good, we tell you this allows independent candidates to step up as a threat to already like postulated systems. You don't necessarily need to have a two-party system anymore. You can have a multi-party system because these people can set up, seeing the NOTA vote, seeing that their election is not a two-party system. They can see that, look, there is a demand for something better. There's a demand for a party that can be good enough. We can represent more ideas more fairly. Secondly, in terms of voters becoming more capable to produce good election outcomes themselves, this means that political informedness of voters become better, which means you get better election results. The reason why this is true is because the effects, and this is what Chinmay said, right? I'm just rebuilding it. The effects of forcing to choose a party versus the effects of choosing nothing is simply better on our side, because in status quo, parties often play the blame game, saying that if we are bad, the other one is far worse. Now people can zoom out of this meaningless discourse and do another test. Are both parties equally bad? This leads to the race to the top, which leads to things like fairer elections, more agency to the individual vote, and better voter turnout, which I've already impacted you in many like ways. But the bottom line is that we get better representation of people's political preferences. The weighing for this being like minorities. Kaushik will also do it later. Therefore, panel, my position is simple. If the founding father of democracy, fucking Socrates, wanted this to happen, I think opposition should not disallow it.
Thank you, DPM, for that fine speech. Calling upon the DLO. Here.
Yeah, hey, audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Cool. POI is sat. I'll take one. Put up a timer for myself. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Understand, government runs a very idealistic case where in the first piece they come ahead and say, oh, hey, this debate is not about what happens in real, but it's just about where are the structures better, because this debate is about the structures of democracy and everything can be gamified. I think this is untrue. One, because my PM already told you, insofar as we can prove that there is like more gamification on our side with like no specific benefits, simply because of how like real structures exist, like how real world operates instead of like an idealistic democracy, we still win. But I think secondly, the kind of way that like people function or politicians functions, if there we prove to you that the kind of impacts that you're trying to pitch will be unable to like come about, we'll still take this debate insofar as we have the harms that we brought ahead in PM. For that, I'll like give you some framings that I think were like unclear, sort of. I think number one, you talk about how minorities will get better representation and how like parties will now race to the top or something. number one, understand if even if like in some constituency, like there are two parties, A, B, and NOTA, and NOTA wins the majority, then a re-election will happen. After the re-election, also there are like only two parties existing, which means A and B, which means instead of like going ahead and like trying to channel votes from like other minorities and all, people can like still go ahead and like have a re-election and then say like, oh hey, I'm still better than the other party that's out there, and like some or the other time you'll have to vote for either party, because you can't just keep voting for NOTA, otherwise it will just take like a very long period of time, which is something that the citizens also don't want. Because even though there are citizens who feel that both these parties are not catering to me, they can't like continuously vote for NOTA, because that will take like a lot of re-election, similar to what happened in Israel. That is something that citizens in general don't want, because they want like their needs from the government to be fulfilled. For that to happen, a government needs to exist, which means they don't want an interim government for like a very long time, which means at the end, even if they vote for NOTA, they like vote for somebody. But I think secondly, why is voter turnout low? I don't think that's simply because people feel that no party is catering to me. I think it's because of a multiple of reasons which you're not able to which you're not able to tackle at that point. And I think in both the worlds, voter turnout will like still be less, insofar as there are people still not believing whether party one is good or party two is good. But I think thirdly, and most importantly, this, how are, I'll take up PY later, how are these minorities divided? Number one, I think you still need, in India, you still need to get like 273 seats in order to like win the elections. If you don't, you have to form a coalition with somebody. I think this ensures that people are catering to like different sorts of people. But then again, how do these minorities exist like within this community, within the country? Government assumes that in one particular constituency where direct voting through people is happening, there are like multiple minorities. I think this is untrue. Insofar as there is one constituency, there is probably like one majority existing there. In different constituency, there are different majorities. These majorities in different constituencies might be an overall minority in the country, is how they're catered to. Which means if I, as party A, want to cater to like religion X, I will probably try to win all the constituencies that have religion X, and will not cater to constituencies that don't have religion X. Which means the kind of intersectionality between these like identities that exist is not within constituencies, but rather different constituencies have like different majorities. Which means this right of like catering to everybody is still protected, insofar as you have to still win 50% of the constituencies. We don't believe this can happen in one constituency, because in reality there isn't just like enough number for like NOTA to succeed, insofar as there is one majority who different parties cater to. And in reality, like when there are two or more parties, both parties have like different voter bases. They don't focus on similar voter bases after like a long-standing election run. That is that party X probably focus on one sort of majority, party Y focuses on probably different sorts of minorities, if those are like less in number, but they're like varied, as government tries to say, because they see that as their path to victory. But all of these people don't exist on at this in the same constituency, is where they try to win different constituencies. The way that this right is channeled, that like everybody gets equal benefits and parties are focusing on everybody, is simple, that you need like 50% constituencies. But I think fourthly, about agency, they say that the principle of agency is important, because then you get to like people get, because you are able to vote for NOTA, and that actually holds some power. I don't understand what power that is, because if NOTA is elected, it's not that something happens, but rather a re-election happens. Structurally, in that re-election also, if NOTA wins, another re-election will happen. This will continue until like one of the existing parties wins, which means this can still just be a fight between who is worse, because like in reality there are only these two parties existing. And I don't understand what, like, if in a long period of time these parties were not able to cater to some people, I don't understand what more they could do in this re-election period to turn the people who have like voted for NOTA earlier. But I think if this agency is important just to showcase how many people are dissatisfied with democracy, which is like sort of like their freedom to like expression, or their freedom to choose their own leader, we feel this is like still symmetric on like every world. Because on your world, like after NOTA, re-election exists, through which people are able to know that, oh hey, in this constituency NOTA won, which means in this constituency people are unhappy with leaders. That can like still happen on our side, insofar as like a lot of people don't come to vote, which is something that still happens in India in the status quo. Like political leaders or media houses believe that a lot of people are not voting because they're dissatisfied with both the parties. This is like, this sort of agency still exists because I'm like choosing to not go and vote, and hence choosing to showcase that I'm unhappy with my leaders. I think this still exists. But like, even on even like in when both these were even like in the status quo, when an option of NOTA exists but it does not have any real power, I still think the amount of votes that NOTA gets that are like still published and still like showcased to the people through which they can know in which constituencies people are unhappy with NOTA, which is why agency still exists. Before that, we were.
What's worse, having to multiply costs of campaigning with each re-election or having to stand in a line every so often?
I think insofar as there are no practical benefits that you're able to achieve, your benefits are like only principle of choice. If I'm able to prove that choice or that agency being showcased is symmetric, and if I'm able to prove to you that the way that minorities exist are like different and like the frame of minorities is inconsistent with the kind of impact that you're trying to bring, I think like cost of re-elections, or rather not cost, but most importantly the time gap becomes more important. This time gap is especially important because there are like a lot of people who are suffering who want to access the benefits that the government can bring to them. If there are like multiple re-elections, if there are like multiple times when the government is simply not functioning, we feel that development is stagnated, like things like poor people not getting food, or like roads not being built, connections and all of these things are like not done. Insofar as that is true, I think these harms stand. I don't think agency is enough proof because, like, again, in a democracy, we can showcase what amount of NOTA is going. But again, I don't think minorities get benefits because in any case, parties will fight for one particular majority. But even if not, they like try to win constituency by constituency. And constituency are mostly majority dominated, which means that the way you cater to minorities is by catering to another constituency, which still exists because you have to like win 273 seats. For all those reasons, I believe the principles of democracy that they try to push either can't exist in realism, or I think secondly are simply symmetric, because of which we don't want to cause this time gap which causes a lot of harms. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana, for that fine speech, calling upon the government whenever you're ready.
Give me 10 seconds. Great. I will take the POI if you can write it in the chat box. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Right now, the political climate is extremely volatile, which means you have to do a couple of things. The first is it allows to have vital access point to state your differences. I think this is still more important than a lot of people choosing bad political parties, which they inevitably don't like. The second is on scale, people's preferences, even if that's none of the above, is much more vital than just abolishing the preference of, hey, you should rather choose somebody. This is a bad option. But secondarily, maximizing agency, having fair elections, having the probability of having re-elections every time that you probably choose like none of the above is still fine, and this is a trade-off that we make, and we would defend it. But couple of responses. The first is, in a democratic election, there's a lot of like preference for the people to just like stand up, vote. Maybe like identity politics, regional blocs, coalitions, etc. can still happen on both sides of the houses. Most of the things that LO says is extremely symmetric on both sides of the houses. I know that democracy is not the best form of, let's say, government that exists in the world right now, but it is the only option in which you can maximize agency to a certain degree, as opposed to other political systems which probably are much more hurtful. The example that they themselves give is Israel. The second is the harm exclusively on their side of the house is people who hate both parties will still have to will still not turn up because they feel that there is no option for us to choose something that we inevitably like. So they end up either choosing something that they don't like or they don't turn up, which is the most like truer option, is the one that they don't turn up in the very first place. Which means at least on our side of the house you can quantify how many people had the non-deterministic vote. Thirdly is results are determining factor of how many people are turning up. On their side of the house you have people showing their preference. Like on their side of the house, people will show preferences in the way that they probably feel aligned to the political parties. That still happens regardless of the preferences that you have. But on our side of the house, people are not forced to make choices, but rather they can probably pick like none of the above, even if they have to do it like multiple times. That's still fine to show the disapproval of the political climate that exists within a developing country which has ultra-nationalism right now. But third is, next thing that they say is, you wouldn't know election commission, you wouldn't know the idea of who is voting in NOTA. I think that's untrue, because election commissioner in every other country, regardless of India, still has a lot of idea of what is happening, like what is my voter ID card, where is the Aadhaar card, etc. All of these information is literally registered in election commission. So that's like a very bizarre game. The third is, independent candidates who are likely to be local good guys or people who are leaders of a community can now increasingly have better chances on our side of the house, and can probably show the confidence with the situations that have occurred. They can probably, like, let's say, weaponize it against the kind of bad guys which are probably present in the elections right now, which means independent let's say peeps can step up uniquely, spend less, or probably can have much more confidence, because now the election has probably turned it. There are more eyeballs, there is more media attention to why the voter capacity is just like the it, and why there is having multiple elections. That's still better on our side of the house, because you are having more media attention, you're having more, let's say, eyeballs on it. You have a lot of people just like aggravated by what the election capacity looks like. But secondarily, on scale, like, parties now probably have much more relevant candidates, because they have already felt that there is a lot more hardship, which means if you have like broader generic promises, like, it's not about Ram Mandir in Dharavi or maybe Bandra or Kolkata, it's about real issues and local issues which can literally get you the votes. Even if that happens on both sides of the houses, I think the capacity for more people turning up on our side of the house is much more higher as opposed to theirs, because people will be apathetic on both sides of the houses. It means we are fine with having more people turning for NOTA, because they know that there is something that's wrong within the constituency, as opposed to being extremely apathetic on their side of the house and still choosing either you force them or either you probably step back. This is the only two options that they have on their side of the house. But thirdly, on gamification, I think gamification can still happen on both sides of the houses, but the degree to which you can probably gamify on our side of the house is extremely clear, which means op is very unclear on what kind of like comparative that they establish. I mean, what are people choosing? What is the degree of the constituency? Do you think that constituency can probably lead to development? All of these things are extremely unclear from the second and the first speech. But thirdly, I think Israel is out of the debate. I think the debate has a place setting. It's India. But even if this is about Israel, they have to prove the certainty of the actions. Israel is working under regimes that is extremely not maximizing agency of the people, which is why this is irrelevant to the most democratic nation, where India is trying to maximize the agency of the people. Non-democratic institutions can still exist on both sides of the houses. But fourthly, I think the next thing that DLO says is intersectionality exists outside. That is true, but why that is not there on our side of the house? I mean, sure, you can have more people just like turning up on their side of the house, but what is the validity of these people having votes for a longer period of time? I mean, sure, they might have only two options, but in the coming elections, they might just give up because there is no certain change that is happening on their side of the house. At least on our side of the house, they're having more choices. They're having much more like ability for people to have a lesser bad guy, as opposed to only choosing the bad guy on their side of the house. But thirdly, there is a cycle of re-elections. We agree there will be multiple cycle of re-elections, because this garners more eyeballs, media discourse, voter talks, and a lot of media participation of why this constituency is not working, why the development is stagnated. This forces a lot of people to make sure that the seriousness of the political participation increases on our side of the house as opposed to theirs, because people will just choose and they don't know the consequence of the development that is being taken part of the political party. On our side of the house, at least on scope, people will turn up because there is NOTA, as opposed to being coerced to choose on their side of the house. But lastly, I think the second speaker knives the first speaker, says that people do know about the information. This proves that people have information about the way people voted in the very first place. If you have more time, you can probably recollect, you can probably re-energize, you can probably tell the political party to be much more serious. They can be much more developed. And the last claim that they make is at least more bizarre, like the development is stagnated. I don't think so. This is a very like comparative claim. Development will not be stagnated. They have to prove the longevity for why development will be stagnated without any political accountability. That doesn't happen in most of the political participation. But first thing, I think a couple of reasons why we exclusively win this debate. First, I think NOTA serves a vital tool in upholding the principle in which you probably like expressing dissatisfaction on the available choices that you have. But secondarily, I think the Supreme Court recommendation aligns with the spirit of electoral integrity. I mean, you can probably have multiple electoral systems, often leads to scenarios where one candidates win or nobody can candidates win. That's fine, because it sort of proves that there is no legitimacy to the electoral participation right now, which means by declaring no one in the constituency, when NOTA garners a majority of the votes, we ensure that candidates are elected based on genuine popular support and genuine discourse, as opposed to having like a lot more divided and fragmented political party on their side of the house. Even if they have coalition, that is the best case. The third is by providing voters with an option to express dissatisfaction. I think a lot of like people can probably have greater political participation on scale and magnitude. On proving this, we have a couple of outcomes. The first is having much more participatory democracy, and this is the only certain thing we are claiming. That's fine that you probably like vote nobody, but that's even fine for having been coerced on their side of the house, which means voter dissatisfaction is still fine on our side, as opposed to we are like say, standing for the guardian of democracy on our side of the house.
Thank you, Gavdev, for that fine speech. Calling upon Optiv. Here.
Just 30 seconds.
Optiv, could you please go ahead and give the speech?
Yeah, hello. Am I audible? Hello.
Yes, you're audible.
Yeah, just a second. Yeah, cool. Hi, Udit, going as the op-whip. Preferred mode of QI between the 5th and the 6th minute. If I have time, I'll definitely take one. Cool. Starting my speech in 3, 2, one. Panel, the kind of framing that they run in this debate, this entire framing falls down on the basis of the impacts that they present to you. They come here and from the very beginning run a very idealistic case. From the very first speech, they agree to the idea that politicians have their own incentives to come to power and they are basically a-holes who have their own agenda in itself. But then they then come here and tell you that if this sort of system exists, these particular voters or these particular voters who are going to vote for NOTA, these politicians are going to actively cater to them. Untrue panel. Each and every politician or each and every political party has a set voter base. They are clearly aware of the people that they need to cater to. For example, when you talk about BJP needs to cater to its Hindu voter base. And when you talk about Congress having maintained its image of a neutral political party would try to cater to each and every section of the community. And therefore, in that sort of scenario, even if this sort of like a particular in a particular constituency, NOTA gets elected, these particular political parties have no active incentive to go forward and cater to these minorities in these particular communities. Rather than doing so, they would actively focus on these particular majorities and try to retain the votes of these majority communities, because they now realize that these particular majority communities are also going to be influenced by other political parties, because this sort of re-election is going to take place. And therefore, each and every political party in each and every one of these political constituencies are only going to focus on their sort of voter base that is currently being present. I do not see exactly as to how these political parties will have an active incentive to cater to each and every section of the community. Even apart from that, we believe that agency or protection of minorities still exists on our side with us. How is that so, panel? I think Raghav comes in and clearly tells to you that you have different constituencies, you have different majorities in these different constituencies, and each and every political party needs to win 50% of the seat, 50% of the constituencies in order to go and form the government. Therefore, even though BJP is a political party who goes forward and actively caters to Hindus, it still needs to go forward. And in certain seats where there are probably A reservations, or in certain seats where they realize that Muslims are in the majority, or where they realize that Muslims can probably make up an essential part of their voter base, they still go forward and cater to them on our side. Therefore, we do not believe that on in any way minorities are going to be much better on their side. Those any sort of like impacts that they push in this debate are largely symmetric. Even then, talking about talking about the ideas of voter turnout, these particular voters who go forward and vote for NOTA in the first place, just they're extremely dissatisfied on their side of this. Okay, agree. But the problem is these that even if re-election is going to occur, this re-election can now still always become a fight between the good and the between the lesser of the two evils, because these political parties have been functioning for a huge amount of time, and therefore they have already become indoctrinated in the kind of policies that they push out in the first place. So even if any sort of re-election is going to occur, what is probably going to occur on their side was that in the current existing policies, they're going to make some very small minor changes that through which they would try to actively coerce the other communities and the other voter bases to come and vote for them. And therefore, in that sort of scenario, any sort of real choice that they push to you is something that still does not exist on our side of the house. Accountability is still that something that exists, because now on our side of the house, since this option of NOTA is getting abolished, so even when you talk about certain areas having a majority dominated party, you still have these particular minorities now having to exercise the option and going to vote for the other party in the first place. And since this other political party that exists in this constituency also wants to win this particular constituency, this other political party would now actively cater to these minorities and actively try to cater to this minority community and try to engage with them in terms of the policies that they form in terms of the next election, or in terms of any sort of electoral process that is going to take place. This sort of accountability is something that still exists on our side. Secondly, in terms of voter turnout, I believe that voter turnout on their side of the house is not going to even increase to such a huge extent. If it increases, these particular voters are like very constricted. They do not believe any of these particular parties are good in the first place itself. For them or any of their impacts to stand, they need to like exactly clearly tell me that what active incentive do these particular voters have, because they are already skeptical of these current political parties that exist on our side of the house. These particular voters are actively catered to, because when a particular losing party loses this election, they realize that these particular other voters are someone that are actively need to cater to. Therefore, this sort of agency is something that still exists on our side. Secondly, their idea about how discourse and policies are going to be much better, I do not understand exactly how that is first of all going to take place, because discourse is something that still exists on our side of the house, because discourse is something that is largely symmetric. Even if a particular re-election goes forward, these political parties have no have they are already indoctrinated in terms of the policies that they present. And in such a scenario, any sort of like big major changes are something that is largely always going to be reflective of catering to their already pre-existing voter base in order to already strengthen their pre-existing voter base. And therefore, this sort of discourse is something that is largely constricted to these particular segments in these particular constituencies in the first place. And therefore, any sort of ideas about discourse that they push forward is something that still does not stand. Secondly, talking about why exactly is the sort of counterfactual that they propose problematic in the first place, because when you talk about the elections, any sort of development work is going to stop. And therefore, in this sort of interim period where this interim government functions, any sort of new policies or any sort of problems that the current community faces is never going to be actively catered to, because in order to ensure a fair and accountable process, you need to ensure that these sort of activities stop in the first place itself. And therefore, in such a scenario, there is going to be an extreme amount of instability. This sort of instability is something that is going to proportionally increase, something which they agree to when they come here and tell me that they bite the bullet on the idea that the re-election is continuously going to re-election, that they agree to the idea that even if re-election is a vicious cycle and continues for a huge amount of time, because they believe that voter agency is more important. But we believe that but on our side of the house, when you talk about instability, this sort of development stagnation, we believe that the impacts of this development stagnation is much more huge, because now these minority communities, or in particular certain communities or certain policies that were going to be now enacted, they are going to stop for a huge fucking amount of time. And therefore, this sort of is going to be problematic, because now the government is now not able to function properly. Even apart from that, we now believe that the repeated cost of election is going to be largely de-incentivizing for smaller political parties and smaller rulers in the first, smaller independent politicians in the first place itself. Because on a comparison to These bigger political parties, they do not have this amount of fund to go repeatedly go forward and campaign, and therefore in such a scenario, any sort of there is going to be a disproportionality in the sort of power dynamics that is going to be now severely going to help these bigger political parties rather than any sort of like help to these independent MLAs that they talk about. With that, proud to oppose.
Thank you, Opera, for that fine speech calling upon the op reply.
Yeah, audible.
Yep, audible.
Cool. I'll start in three, two, one. Panel first, understand why the harms that we push are like important, which they keep questioning that, oh, like we can keep having a series of re-election. We don't care as long as people are able to exercise that choice. Understand why this is untrue. Because when interim government exists for a very long period of time, where there are like continuous cycles of re-elections, there are policies that are not being passed. There are benefits that are not being given. These benefits or these policies are most important for vulnerable people, and these vulnerable people are not able to like exercise these things insofar as there are interim governments who are existing for a long period of time. But what is the end result of this? You anyways have to choose between the parties that already existed, that were already bad, because like before two re-elections you voted for NOTA. The fact that you took the effort to go ahead and vote for NOTA instead of like choosing not to vote means you very strongly feel towards like disliking both the parties. If you were just a fence sitter who's like, okay, I like don't like any of these parties, I don't have such a strong opinion, you would just probably go and not vote because that's how humans work. But the fact that you go ahead and vote for Nota means you feel very strongly against both those parties. Means I don't understand what like one or two re-elections in a span of like 15 days or 1 month can change so drastically that now you go ahead and start liking one of the parties, which means that the way you vote for one of the parties because you don't want interim government to exist in your constituency for very long, because you want the government to function and all of its benefits to reap, is by like voting for the party which is less bad, which is exactly what happens on our side, except it does not take that time, that amount of time, or that amount of costs. Even if those costs are not important, which like we agree, fine, the government should be ready to spend that money. We believe they're important if nothing else stands in this debate, which are basically your principles, which don't reap the same amount of benefits that they need to in like in a realistic scenario. But I think secondly, if these costs are not important, this time still becomes important simply because of all the things that I talked about. But I think secondly, you talk about agency awareness and all that. I've already explained why principle of agency does not stand. Simply because even if like your argument was that if people are not voting versus if people are voting for Nota, at least you know how many people are exactly dissatisfied with the government versus like not coming. I think the fact that you don't go ahead and vote shows that you're not like happy with like any one party, which is like a fair enough number. But I think still on a comparative, this is like pushing a wall, because you knowing the number of people who didn't vote versus you knowing how many people voted for Nota, I don't think there is like anything you can do exactly of that number because of like the small scale on it. Like I don't understand how that's principally just like how that stands principally, knowing the number of people who voted for Nota over knowing the number of people who just didn't go to vote. But I think thirdly, your point about minorities, and this is where our framing comes in. Minorities don't exist within constituencies. Different minorities exist in different constituencies. Like simple intuition, minorities like exist with their own communities within like certain different spaces away from majority, which means if there is one particular religion X, it's probably not coexisting in constituencies where religion Y is dominant, but rather it exists in one particular constituency where their own religion exists, which means that the way you cater to these minorities is not by catering to everybody in one constituency, rather you cater to every majority in every constituency, and these minorities are a majority in some other constituency, which means catering to minorities still exists as long as the rule of gaining votes in more than 50% of the constituencies exist, which means you still cater to minorities simply because of the frame of how minorities are like distributed. But I think except that you say that political campaigning becomes better. This is like a knife to your own frame where you say that politicians are like bad people, which means instead of catering to people, they'll just do things like coercion or like bad politics just to get their votes, which is something that already happens, but it will happen more because now they're not just fighting against somebody else, but they're fighting against Nota, which means if on your side you're simply amplifying things, the amount of gamification that Chinmay said should not be a part of this debate is also amplified. You never tackle that while that is brought in our second and third speeches. Because of all of these reasons, like op, vote op.
Thank you, op reply. Calling upon the gov reply.
This is DPM going reply, although I don't think that matters for tabbing anything. Starting in 3, 2, 1. It's true that the dominant political party always gamifies the system. It's also, however, equally true that the non-dominant party also tries to gamify the system, thereby depriving thousands of minorities, swing voters, fence sitters, etc., of the rights that they deserve. Let's explain how an election works. There are 543 single-member constituencies who all elect MPs. MPs are elected for 5-year terms unless dissolved earlier. Hello, Rishi Sunak. Each MP, therefore, represents the interest of the particular constituency that they are in. Does this mean that a majority will never be won by a party? In most cases, no. But if a party does win more seats, it's better for them. Note what's the mechanism that we operate under. This has been true since Chinmaya's speech. Minorities who currently don't want to vote for BJP for obvious reasons, vote for Congress. Congress knows that minorities are already going to vote for them. They have jack incentive to provide more to the minorities. This is the freebies argument that we flipped on them. When now minorities have an option to vote NOTA and therefore take votes away from Congress, take seats away from the India bloc, Congress has to necessarily do better. But now that Congress does better, BJP also has to do better because now they're losing some swing voters away from them towards Congress, which means now BJP stands to either lose seats or do better. In either case, it's a win-win. But coming back to the idea that a majority will never be won and that elections will never come to a result, that's just untrue, right? Voter turnout in India is 67%. The global average is 64%, which means most of the time a majority can be won to a single party. The question is how much power that party gets and how that party represents their particular constituency better. But let's say, hypothetically, that in some cases a majority is won by NOTA and therefore the party does not even come to power. This is even better for us because it shows on an international level across all media houses, left wing or right wing, that India has failed to have a fair electoral system, that both parties are dog shit. What are the impacts? Per constituency, you get more and better fence sitter representation. Who are fence sitters? Minorities who are fucked by either party or anyone who is fucked by either party. And since both parties want their vote, no party wants to go through re-elections again. They will try to do better. Just because you fail to conceptualize what happens in each re-election cycle doesn't mean parties don't do that. They analyze what preferences are, which is exactly what democracy is. And they try to cater to these preferences insofar as these preferences, the question is not, oh, do we show this preference or not? The question is, how do we show these preferences better under our system? Versus on your side, you have no incentive to do this in the first place because you already have a guaranteed so-called vote because the current NOTA system as it stands is shit. But as a whole, the platform, and this has got no rebuttal, right? We talked about multi-party versus bi-party system in my speech. Although I spent little time analyzing it as a claim, it still holds crucial impact. So I'll just do it here. There's a better platform for other parties to come on because India is not a two-party system and there's no reason for it to be. NOTA indicates that there is a problem with the system, and this gives a platform for parties to come together to hop on to fix this problem. People get more confidence now that BJP is not getting as many votes. People get more confidence that there's no longer one dominant party that's winning a very high majority of seats at all points in time, which means we get better call out, better accountability, and much, much better representation. Not just through another party coming in, but through the existing parties also being incentivized to change. The reason why NOTA will definitely work under this system is because on a principle level, it accounts for the preferences of individuals to say that the system is shit and we want a revamp. We want to hold our criminal politicians accountable. We want to get a better representation. We want to prevent processes like gerrymandering. And this causes, due to the pains of elections, people to work harder and do better, to do enough to cross that threshold, to become better political representatives of the people that they have entered into a social contract with in order to create a better social system. For these reasons and for all of the reasons proudly presented earlier, we've never been prouder to oppose or propose.
Thank you, Gov reply, for that fine speech. Thank you guys for the debate. It's a silent round. You guys can leave. We'll be announcing the verdict directly in the auditorium. Meanwhile, panelists, could you please DM me your verdict?